Hello, 6th graders. We're in our rational numbers unit. We're looking today at percents and decimals. 3 learning targets for you to write down. I can write percentages as decimals. I can write percentages with fractions as decimals. And I can write decimals as percentages. Okay, something for us just to think about here. Think about percents and what they represent. So thinking back to the last video we did about percents. And then think also about our number system and what the numbers to the right of the decimal or after the decimal, what do they represent? Okay, so if we have 7% here and we want to write this number as a decimal, there's 2 methods that we should be recording in our notebook. The first one is to start with writing the percent as a fraction, and then from there figure out how that fraction is written as a decimal. So if we have 7%, we know from the video with percents and fractions that percents are always out of 100. So 7% would be 7 over 100. Now if I read this number, I would read it as 7/100ths. And that tells me we have our decimal, and the 7 ends in the hundredths place, which is 2 spots after the decimal. And since there's nothing to go in the tenths place, we fill it in with a 0 and then a 7. So 7% would look like that as a decimal. The second method is to divide mentally. So when we have 7 out of 100, what we're really doing is we're taking 7 divided by 100. And anytime that we divide something by 100, well, let's start first if we were to divide by 10. Anytime we divide by 10, it moves the decimal 1 spot to the left. So let's say we had 40 and we were dividing that by 10. All we would do, that equals 4, which is moving the decimal 1 spot. So if we were dividing by 100, that means that we move the decimal 2 places to the left. And then add any zeros. So if there's an empty spot, you fill it in with a 0. So for 7%, our decimal falls at the end of our number here. And then from here, we move the decimal 1, 2 spots to the left. We have an empty spot here, so we fill it in with a 0. So our answer, we put a 0 in front of the decimal point as a placeholder. That would be our answer. So either way, we get the same thing. One method, write it as a fraction first. Other one, just move the decimal 2 to the left. Some of them for you to try here. Pause, try them on your own, and then come back and check. So we have 8% decimals at the end of the number. I prefer to just move the decimal. I find it easier than writing it as a fraction. It makes an extra step for you. But if that's the way you want to solve it, definitely go and do that. Decimal 1, 2 spots to the left. Fill in with a 0 in that blank spot. So we would have 0.08 or 8/100ths, which if you did the fraction method would be 8 out of 100, 8/100ths. Either way works. 54% decimals at the end of the number. Move it 1, 2 spots to the left. Just like that. 84 and 2/10%. We start now where the decimal is in the middle of this number. So it's between the 4 and the 2. So from here, we move 1, 2 spots to the left. We don't start at the end of the number after the 2. We start where the decimal already is. 842. And that's it as a decimal. Okay, just some real world word problems here for us to solve. Alaska is the largest state, making up 16 1/10% of the land area of the United States. Write this amount as a decimal. So first, I'm going to write that 1/10 as a decimal. That tells me that the 1 is in the tenths place. Now, you may think it's already as a decimal because there's a decimal point in the middle of the number, but it has that percent sign on it, so we need to get rid of that. And to do that, we move the decimal 2 spots to the left. So our answer would look like that. So that's the amount of decimal area that the Alaska takes up. 2 more for you to try here on your own. About 6 4/5% of the total area of the U.S. is water. What decimal represents this amount? So 4/5, let's start with writing that fraction as a decimal. Well, 4/5, I know I can get the denominator to easily be 10 by multiplying by 2, which would be 8/10. So then that means it would look like 6 and 8/10, pulling that 6 from in front of here, percent. So now from here, now that we have the number as a percent, we can move the decimal 2 spots to the left. So my answer, 0.068. That would be my answer. Now I know it seems really small, but it's telling us 6%. That's a very, very small amount of something. The total area of Australia is about 38 and 11/20% of the total area of North America. Write this amount as a decimal. Well, again, 11/20. I know I can multiply 20 by 5 to get a nice denominator of 100. So that would be 55 over 100, which as a decimal, put the 38 back in front of it, 38 and 55/100%. From here, we move the decimal 2 spots to the left. Again, we start with where the decimal is in the middle of the number, not at the very end. So 0.3855. So that's the amount that Australia is of North America. Now going the other way, if we have a decimal and we want to write this as a percent, there's 2 ways that we can do this. We could write it as a fraction. So this number here, I would read it as 4/10, which would be 4 over 10. However, we need percents to be out of 100, so we need this denominator to be 100. I know that 10 times 10 is 100, so I would multiply the top by 10, which would be 40 over 100, which would be 40%. So you can write it as a fraction and then get that bottom number to be 100, and then once this bottom number is 100, then just whatever your numerator is what your percent would be. The other option is to multiply mentally. Just like when we were moving from a percent to a decimal, we move the decimal 2 to the left. When we're turning it to a percent, we go the other way, which is written down here. So, because percents are out of 100, if we have a decimal, we would multiply by 100 to turn it into a percent. And multiplying by 100 moves the decimal spot 2 to the right. So starting where our decimal is here, we move 1, 2 spots, fill in with a 0, so that would be 40%. 2 methods, either one works. Okay. Try these 3 on your own. So 5/10, I'm going to do the moving the decimal. I just move it 2 spots to the right, 1, 2. Fill in with a 0, so that would be equal to 50%, which if we did the fraction method, that would be 5/10, multiply the top and bottom by 10, so that would be 50 over 100, 50%. Either way works. 34/100, you could either just say, well, that's 34 out of 100, 34%, or move the decimal 1, 2 to the right, 34%. 9/100, move the decimal 1, 2 to the right, so that would just be 9%. I'm just moving the decimal. Just a little word problem here to try. Each day, Rico and his dog walk 625 thousandths of a mile. What percent of a mile do they walk? Well, for this, I'm just going to move the decimal 1, 2 to the right. So that would be 62 and a half, decimal falls in between the 2 and the 5, percents of a mile. Okay, so the main parts of the video here that you should have written down in your notebook. The key concepts that we need to keep in mind as we're moving between decimals and percents. If we have a percent and we are going to a decimal, all that you need to do is divide by 100, which is moving the decimal 2 to the left. Move decimal 2 to the left. If we are going from a decimal to a percent, we are multiplying by 100, which is moving the decimal 2 spots to the right. To the right. So it just depends on what you're converting to. You're either moving left or right 2 places. Go back if you are confused and need some more practice. Otherwise, there's always iExcel that you could practice on, and come with questions to class.